Good afternoon. My name is Russ Morgan with the law firm of Bradley. I'm here today with Rick Humbracht to go through his oral history on behalf of the Oral History Project for the Nashville Bar Association. Rick, go ahead and start the process by telling your full name.
My name is Harold Frederick Humbracht, Jr. And my nickname is Rick, came from Frederick.
And what's your date of birth?
I was born in 9/3/1946 in Opelika, Alabama.
And tell us about your growing up. Where'd you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Opelika. I stayed there from, I guess, birth until 1963 when I moved to Chattanooga for 1 year when I was a senior in high school. In Opelika, my mother ran a restaurant. I used to work in the restaurant. I caddied on the weekends for the president of Opelika National Bank. I made enough money caddying on the weekend to play golf all the next week. And then a little bit later, I started working for a A&P grocery store, bagging groceries over the weekends. And then I guess in 1963, as I said, my mother remarried a man from Chattanooga, and we moved to Chattanooga.
And so how long were you working with A&P?
About 2 years, 14 to 16.
And was there any special customers that you had from time to time when you worked with A&P?
Well, there was a big mill in Opelika, the Pepperell Mill, and they got paid on Friday, and there was always a couple that used to come in, and I would bag their groceries and on Saturday morning, and they gave me a quarter tip. And as I mentioned to you earlier, that was 25% of my hourly wage for $1 an hour as a grocery boy bagger, I guess you would call it.
Now, earlier we were talking, and I asked you why you chose Tennessee, and you said you grew up close to Auburn. Is that where Opelika is?
Correct.
For all the
Tennessee touch.
So for all the Tennessee fans, you're a reformed Auburn fan?
Yeah, I escaped from Alabama.
You escaped. All right, so you lived in Chattanooga for a year. What high school did you attend in Chattanooga?
I went to Chattanooga City High School for 1 year, and then from there I went to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
How'd you make the decision to go to the University of Tennessee?
Well, it was a state school, and it was close. That's about it.
I
planned on going to Auburn before, but then when we moved out of state, it made economic sense to go to UT.
And did you know what you wanted to do when you went to UT?
I had always wanted to do business, thought about that, and I majored in accounting in Knoxville. So that was the I guess the preliminary going into law school.
Now, I understand you played golf. Did you play any other sports when you were in high school?
Played football, played baseball, basketball, and golf.
All around athlete then, huh?
No, frustrated jock.
What was your favorite sport?
I guess football was probably it for the first couple of years, and then I blew out a knee in my junior year in high school, and so that sort of limited what I could do from that point on.
When did you start playing golf?
When I was about 12. My mother was a big influence on that because back then her comments were that more deals are closed on the golf course than in the boardrooms. And so she was able to convince me at that point to continue to play golf.
And did you find that to be good advice?
I found that to be very good advice.
And do you still play golf today?
I still play a lot of golf today. That's why I have the suntan that I've got.
Now, when you went to Knoxville, did you have a favorite professor?
Not initially, but then when I got into my major in the accounting department, I guess it would be Warren Slagle. Dr. Slagle was the head of the accounting department, and I had a couple of courses under him, and I was pretty successful in those courses. And I guess that's probably the most important course that I had.
Did you always enjoy math?
I'm not educated. I'm trained. That's the way it was both in undergraduate school and in law school.
And did you end up using your accounting background when you practiced law?
Yeah, it worked out well because after law school, and I came up here to Nashville to start practicing law. I did a lot of banking work, a lot of commercial work, and so having an understanding of balance sheets and the profit and loss statements, et cetera, and understanding how businesses functioned helped a lot.
Did you work while you were in college?
I did. Dr. Slagle got me involved with the accounting firm. I guess it was Ernst & Ernest at that point, and they engaged me to be the bookkeeper for the City Club in downtown Knoxville. And so I was sort of the accounting and assistant manager, I guess is the best way to describe it. So I was working almost full time there from my second, third, and fourth year before law school.
Now, I understand that you had a very favorite classmate in one of your political science classes. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
My wife had been to, soon-to-be wife, future wife, had been to Converse College, which was an all-girls school over in South Carolina in Spartanburg, and she had come back to UT, where she was from. She was from Knoxville. And we met in a political science course when I was a freshman and she was a junior. She was 2 years older at that time. I loved to needle her a little bit about that. She was robbing the cradle.
She's still 2 years older?
Hey, let me think about that one. That's a good one. Yes, and so we met, and from that point on, I think we started dating I guess the spring quarter of that year, and dated for several years, and ended up getting married in 1970. As a matter of fact, we've been married since.
Now, were you able, when you worked at the City Club, did you get to meet any influential people?
Yes, I mean it was mostly the business folks from downtown, the bankers, the accountants, and really the main players in the financial market in Knoxville. And then later, when we'll get into this, I'm sure, but later when I had a big case over there, it involved a lot of those same individuals that I had known from the City Club days.
So you were able to put your educational background into practice pretty early with the City Club then? Well,
that was a little bit later, but after law school, I did do a lot of commercial litigation that brought into play the accounting background.
Well, but you had also done some bookkeeping though for the City Club?
Oh yes.
Yeah, that was part of what you were doing, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to that's what I understood. So tell us how you made the decision to go to law school as opposed to go into a practicing accountant.
Well, let me go into this. Back in the mid-'60s, I'd been drummed out of the ROTC Corps, high advanced ROTC program, because of my knee injury, and I had a 4F classification on the draft. And this was, of course, during the Vietnam War period. And after graduation in 1968, the buildup of troops, the draft, the lottery and the draft, et cetera, had a lot of people coming out of college sort of on pins and needles, not knowing what their future was. Me coming out, having already been classified as a 4F, I had a lot of job offers, both from the accounting world. You know, I'd interviewed with several of the Big 8 firms, called Big 8 firms back then. I think it's now 4 or whatever it is. And I was looking at going to work in the accounting field. Again, going back to my soon-to-be wife, and had always thought I was going into law school. As I had said, I was thinking about doing that as well. And she was very instrumental, because she said, look, if you go in with an accounting firm now, you'll make money, but you will never know if you made the right decision as to go to law school or just go to work for an accounting firm. You can always go to work for an accounting firm after law school if you don't like the practice of law. So I give my wife credit for, I guess, urging me to go into law school, and I have never looked back. I've enjoyed it ever since.
Now, I want to go through a couple of statistics to give the audience a little bit of perspective. University of Tennessee has how many students now?
I don't know. It's under 30,000.
And when you first started college at the University of Tennessee, how many students were on campus?
There were 10,000 on campus, 5,000 of whom were in my class. So I was the original baby boomer. And then in 4 years, they had capped the enrollment on the Knoxville campus at 30,000. So I guess there were about 28,000 there.
So it stayed around 30,000 since.
I assume that it has. I don't think they've increased the enrollment there.
And what was your tuition, the best of your memory, when you were in college?
I think it was about $500 a quarter, if I'm not mistaken, when I was first started. And then even at law school, I think it was like $750 a quarter or something like that.
So, and you chose to go to UT for law school?
Yes, yes.
And how many people were in your freshman class at University of Tennessee?
A little over 100. I think there were like 95 or 100 that graduated started in June. In the fall of '68. Graduated in '71, and so I think there were about 100 in the class when we graduated.
And how many females?
Probably 4. I think it was 3 or 4.
And who was your favorite? What was your favorite class in law school?
Gosh, I can tell you those ones that I didn't like. No, I don't know. I did real well in contracts. I was a 5-hour course, and I got a 4.0 in it at that point. So that's 20 quality points, and so that sort of set me up going forward at that point. We had a lot of old colonels. These were people that had come out of the JAG Corps that were now teaching at the College of Law. And there were some good old codgers in there. I mean, but nice folks. I don't know. I just remember Colonel Gray was one of the ones that he taught personal property. I remember that course pretty well. But I guess I don't really have any major classes that I've liked more than others.
So when you went to law school, you chose law school over going in to work for an accounting firm. Did you think you were going to be a trial lawyer, or were you going to be a business lawyer when you started law school?
Didn't know. Had no idea.
What caused you to decide to be a trial lawyer?
Well, in law, after I guess my second year in law school, I was accepted to the Justice Department's honors program. I was either going to be in the antitrust or the tax division. But then later, a federal court clerkship opened up, and I was offered that job, and I decided to go with the court. And that exposed me to the judiciary. It exposed me to the litigation, and that's sort of how I got into it at that point. And then after I started practicing law, one of the first things I did was try a case. And so I was doing that for quite some time. So
when you graduated from law school, you didn't necessarily know you were going to be a trial lawyer or a litigator?
I really didn't. I knew that by going to the federal courthouse, working for the federal judge, that of course that would expose me to the judiciary more than the business world. So I just assumed that would be what would happen. I don't recall it.
So we're going to talk a little bit about your clerkship, but before we get to that, what else happened during law school that was of great significance in your life?
Well, I got married.
No?
Ann and I got married in June of 1970, and we've been married since.
So tell us a little bit about your clerkship.
All right, I clerked for Federal District Court Judge Frank Wilson. Judge Wilson was in Chattanooga at that time, and he was the chief judge for the Eastern District of Tennessee. He was just a fantastic mentor. I had great respect for him. He was a fine jurist, a real intelligent person, and his concept was he wanted the litigants to understand why he did what he did. So in writing memos to him, which ultimately would be incorporated hopefully into orders on motions, etc., or findings of facts and conclusions of law, he went into great detail explaining his explanation and his reasoning. And so that required more than just simply writing on it granted or denied on a motion like some judges had gotten into the habit of doing. And so that really struck me as letting the people know why the decisions are being made the way they are. And it helped me from the standpoint of having to understand and try to analyze issues to make them understandable. And it's a good way to think about things. How would you try to explain this to someone who may not know the technical issues that are involved in the case? And that was his philosophy. And I sort of adopted some of that in some of the briefs that I had written in the past.
And how did you end up getting that clerkship? Did you apply for it, or were you contacted?
Yeah, well, yes, there was I don't know, just some announcement that these would be people that are interviewing at certain times, and that's how I signed up for it, and I was accepted, and I decided to take it over the Justice Department job.
And clerkships in today's practice become very important. Were they as important back then when you were doing a clerkship as they are now?
I think so. Listen, it was a wonderful experience. Any young lawyer who gets an opportunity to do it should. Either if you don't even do it, may not even do it right out of law school. Second year people, it is a wonderful experience, particularly with Judge Wilson, because he gave me so much responsibility. And I have some fond memories of those days.
Were you the only clerk you had?
I was at that time. In my second year, I think the Congress appropriated an extra position for the chief judges of the various district courts, and he would have had 2 at that time.
So how many years were you a clerk?
2 years. I went in 71 and then finished in July of 73.
Tell us a little bit about some of your fun activities or experiences while you were a clerk.
Well, I guess the most interesting thing that we did was back in I guess in 71, right after I started, 72, early 72, Judge Wilson had tried the Jimmy Hoffa jury tampering charge. And I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but what had happened, Hoffa was charged with I think it was the Test Fleet case that was here in Nashville, and based upon some events that occurred here, the government indicted him again for jury tampering, and that was based on the events, obviously, that occurred in Nashville, but his trial was going to be in Chattanooga because there was a lawyer from Nashville by the name of Osborne who was also being tried, and they changed the venue down to Chattanooga. But we had the final 2255 proceeding that was brought by Hoffa, and it was the knowing use of perjured testimony. And what had happened in that case was that a bodyguard by the name of, I think it was Henry Grady Parton, was with Hoffa around the clock, and he was a plant. I don't know if he was a plant. They said he was a plant, but he turned state's evidence basically, and he testified in that case, and his testimony was very instrumental in getting Hoffa convicted. So we had to read the entire trial transcript, specifically with his emphasizing on his testimony, and it was just a great experience looking at the trial. I guess in hindsight, seeing what had been done, both setting up Henry Grady Parton's testimony in the federal court, and how the prosecutor in that case, a young lawyer by the name of Jim Neal, obviously, who went on to fame, handled the proceedings. And so that was one of the events that was a very fun thing to work on. As a matter of fact, I was in Judge Wilson's office when John Mitchell, who was then the Attorney General for Nixon, told Judge Wilson that Nixon was going to be pardoning Hoffa. And so shortly after that, of course, that the pardon took place, and sometime later, Hoffa disappears.
So how did Judge Wilson take the news that Hoffa was going to be pardoned?
Well, it had been such a tough trial that I think he was a little bit concerned or upset that it was going to happen. That was one of those cases where the defendant's lawyers had tried to force errors in the case by the Chicago 7 trial was one of those type of cases where the defendants just went wild. And I can recall one of the instances, one of the attorneys threw $20 silver at the court and called him Judas. And another one, there was an affidavit that was put in the record that the judge was at the Reed House Hotel with some prostitutes, saying that he was going to get Hoffa. And so it was a real nasty thing. During the entire trial, the U.S. Marshals had to accompany the judge home, and they basically staked out his house around the clock because of threats that were coming in that case. So it was a real trying experience for the court. So I think, he never really mentioned his true feelings about it, but you could tell that it was a little bit upsetting that this was taking place. I mean, of course, now, Hoffa subsequently died or has disappeared, I assume, and they're trying to dig up his body at this point right now.
So just for timeline purposes, describe for the audience, Hoffa's first trial was here in Nashville, and in what time period was that?
It was in early 60s, probably 63, 4. And then 66, I believe, was when the actual trial took place in Chattanooga. And so the phone calls would have been in 72, and the final 2255 proceeding would have been in 1972.
And you were reviewing the transcript from the trial that was in 66 in Chattanooga.
Yes, right, not the Test Fleet case.
And he was acquitted in the Test Fleet case?
No, he wasn't acquitted. Oh. I think it was they found out about the jury tampering, and I don't think there was ever
any
conviction in that, or any indication as to what took place in that case. I don't remember.
Okay. And then he got convicted in 60 in the jury tampering trial.
Jury tampering trial, that is correct.
Now, during your time with the judge, did he begin to entrust more responsibility with you in terms of what you were doing?
The second year was probably the best, because that was when I was doing an awful lot of work with the members of the bar. As the only law clerk, and I guess at that time the magistrate judge was part-time, so I started doing the pretrial conferences, let's say, and doing settlement conferences on behalf of the court. So I didn't have any authority, obviously, but he gave me a lot of responsibilities in setting up these meetings and in dealing with the attorneys. And that was a great experience, dealing with the lawyers.
Did you have any particular experience when you were working with Judge Wilson where you got to learn a little bit about moonshine?
Well, back then, back in the early 70s, the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people were more involved with shutting down these moonshiners. And the area down in Tracy City and Dunlap was notorious for where the moonshiners were. And one of the first things that I was called upon to do was to prepare jury instructions. And I recall asking the court one time about a case that was about to be heard, and asked if I needed to prepare any instructions. And he said, no, I don't think you need to at this point. There's a motion to suppress evidence, and once we hear that, I think there'll probably be a plea. And I was sort of confused. So, well, how do you know? And he said, well, back about 2 or 3 years ago, there were several cases that came up where there were some questionable searches and seizures. And I wrote an opinion that said that if the ATF people were able to testify that they physically observed smoke or some other reason for them to be looking for a still, and if they observed the still, and if they were watching it and they saw a car that came in and saw people loading something in that car, and if they saw where that car was going and it was later stopped and voluntarily searched, the ATF person would walk up to the car and say, buddy, I'd like to look in your trunk. And I said, sure, here are my keys. And he opens the trunk and he finds the whiskey, and then they make the arrest. And he said, I wrote an opinion that said that if it occurred that way, then it would be a legal search. And ever since that time, their testimony has been that that's exactly what occurred. And so it was one of those practical approaches to jurisprudential issues, I guess you would say.
Kind of gave them a roadmap.
A roadmap, and it's been that way ever since.
Now I'm going to back up just a little bit and get a little bit more into your background. You said you married Ann in 1970.
Yes. And
do you all have children?
We do. We've got boy-girl twins who were born in 82 and an older son who was born in 79. And
do you have any lawyers in your family?
Well, you asked that question. My youngest son is married to Rachel McCoy, who went to law school. I had no influence on that situation at all, but she is now practicing law here in Nashville.
And none of your children then went directly into law school?
No, they didn't. My son Rob is in San Diego, and he has a couple of businesses out there, one of which is an admissions counseling business where he's helping people get into med schools. That's primarily his client base. And then he's also got a business that involves shadowing by med students with physicians where they have engaged the doctors and they've got cameras and the med students don't have to be there. And this has worked out real well in COVID times, but they're able to observe the interactions between the doctors and the patients. Mm-hmm. And then my daughter Margaret has a little son who lives here, and they live in Nashville. She's a stay-at-home mom, and my other son John is in the computer industry, working. I think he's doing some programming, something to that effect.
So tell us about the bar exam. We jumped on and talked about your clerkship. Before you started your clerkship, you had to pass the bar. Anything memorable about the bar?
I remember it very well. I can still remember some of the questions that were asked, and I remember one of them had to do with a case that I recall the name of because one of my favorite instructors was a guy named Colonel Gray, and he emphasized this particular case at one point under the Uniform Partnership Act, and it was the conversion of real estate to personalty for inheritance purposes. And so I was able to cite the name of the case, Coultraw versus Coultraw. I still remember the citation to it. And also in that case, and this is just sort of, I guess, happenstance, but Bob Crossley, a lawyer from Knoxville, had a review course. And Bob was very good, and that course was extremely well prepared. He was well done, and he was able to give us hints as to what issues might be on the exam, like what's the difference between a motion to dismiss under Rule 12 and a motion for summary judgment. And I recall there was another case that he said, here's something you might think about because the Sixth Circuit has ruled one way and the Tennessee Supreme Court has ruled on another. And so I think this was before multi-state, so we just had essay questions. And I think he probably gave us the answer to 6 of the 8 questions. And so it was pretty good, particularly when you're able to cite a case on it.
Did anybody ever comment on your memory of the case?
After I was in Chattanooga clerking for Judge Wilson, one of the lawyers from Chattanooga who was on the, I guess the bar exam group, or whatever you call it, commented that they had known that I had cited a case on the bar exam and was wondering how that I remembered that particular case.
You always remembered cases all the way through your career, didn't you?
Really did. As I said, I was not educated, I was trained.
All right, so you did your clerkship. Was there anything else about the clerkship that you wanted to discuss or that you remember as significant?
Well, some of it ties in because in the Hoffa deal, Jim Neal tried that case for the government. And you got to go back and look at those days. You had Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General, and he had a, quote, get Hoffa squad, and Jim Neal tried that case. So, of course, when we moved here to Nashville, Jim, to me, he had done an exceptionally good job in setting up the testimony that Henry Grady Pardon gave. For instance, he put into the record the architectural drawings for the Nashville train station, and he had pictures of the murals, and no one could figure out where he was going with that. But of course, when Henry Grady Parton testified, he talked about this one particular mural that showed the African Americans hauling bales of cotton in a truck, or not in a truck, in a wagon. And Hoffa had commented that they were the first teamsters. So when Grady Parton was laying the groundwork, so to speak, for these meetings that occurred to try to influence the jury, he was able, Jim Neal set it up so that the jury had already seen the pictures, and it brought it to life when Grady Parton then was testifying, let's say, about what Hoffa had said about this particular mural. I mean, I just remember some of those things. But then when we came to Nashville, my wife Ann became good friends with Jim's wife, and so we were able to eat dinner with Jim often and go out. It was sort of intimidating, you know. Say, well, Jim, what'd you do today? And, or Jim would ask me, what was I doing? I said, well, I was over in General Sessions Court. I had to get an eviction from an apartment complex, something like that. How about yourself, Jim? Well, I was up in Alaska dealing with the Exxon Valdez. It was a pretty interesting experience.
So tell us how you ended up getting introduced to working in Nashville.
As I said, in my second year of the clerkship, I went to Knoxville to interview potential candidates, and the dean of the law school took me to lunch with a lawyer from Nashville by the name of Robert Eccles, and we sort of hit it off. And Robert was up there. We were both there for the Alabama-Tennessee football game, to be candid about it. And but Eccles invited me to come to Nashville, excuse me, and to interview with their firm. And at that point, it was a new firm that had just started the previous year called Dearborn and Ewing, and that was a firm here in Nashville that was a merger between some lawyers from Bailey, Ewing, Dale, and Connor, and Dearborn, Warner, and Alexander. And at that time, there were 12 lawyers within the firm. And so I met all the people, and decided that, you know, hey, I'd rather go to Nashville than go to Washington with the Justice Department. And so I did. And that's how I'd never been to Nashville other than passing through, driving to Memphis, I guess. And they convinced me to come to work up here, and I did.
So there were 12 lawyers, 13 lawyers?
I think I was the 13th.
Who were some of the lawyers that were part of that law firm?
Well, it started out with Andrew Ewing, and Andrew was about 70 at that time. Bill Dearborn was I don't know, in his 60s, I guess. And you had Bob Warner. They had an office in Franklin as well. And Lamar Alexander was in it at that time. So it was a real good group of people trying to take the entrepreneurial role in the practice of law. Best way to describe it.
Well, once you started practicing, tell us a little bit about what your early experiences were with the firm.
I came to the firm, I guess, in the end of July, and about the middle of August, Bob Warner walks into the office and says that he's got a deposition he wants me to go with him to. And so we go over, and you don't know Bob. He was a great lawyer, smart as a whip, but he was very disorganized, not unorganized, disorganized. His files, you know, he'd walk into the office with a file folder with pages looking like they were going to fall out. But anyway, we go over to this deposition, and he sits there, and, you know, without any notes, and he does a real good job in taking this deposition of the plaintiffs in this case. And after it was over, he said, now, this case is set for trial in September, right after Labor Day, and I want you to try it. I'm going to London with my daughter. And so I had been with the firm, I guess, 2 weeks, and then in the next month, I had my first case, and it was an aiding and abetting a securities fraud violation case in front of L. Clure Morton, who at that time was the district court judge here in Nashville. So Lou Connor held my hand for that first trial, and we ended up getting a verdict in favor of the bank on that. The bank was accused of aiding and abetting the securities fraud violation.
So Lou Conner was one of the lawyers you worked with?
He was.
I understand there were some political-oriented lawyers. You mentioned Lamar. Who else was part of that law firm?
Well, Lamar had been in charge of the Winfield Dunn campaign in 1970. And after that, at that point in time, rather, the governor could not succeed himself. So Lamar had kept the political organization intact, and he was planning to run in 1974. So when we first moved to Nashville, the firm had offices in the old Knoll Hotel and the old Commerce Union Bank building before it was torn down and made way for the point, so to speak. And Lamar had his political people in the office there, waiting, working around the clock basically to keep his organization intact. So when he ran, that it would just be a smooth transition. But of course, Watergate took care of that. He did run. He was defeated by Ray Blanton initially, and then after that, he came back. At one point, I think he went to Washington and worked with Howard Baker. But he was always the political person within the firm. Later, an associate joined the firm by the name of John Edwards. And he later left the firm, went back to North Carolina with his wife Elizabeth. And of course, John became a U.S. Senator. And he also ran for president, as did Lamar. Lamar not only was governor, but he became senator and ran for president as well.
So you've worked with 2 senators and 2 former presidential candidates in your career.
I guess that's right. Yeah.
Pretty.
And of course, we had the judges that came out of there. Matt Sweeney was appointed by Lamar to the Circuit Court bench. Robert Eccles was appointed as a federal court judge as well. And then Lou was appointed by Lamar as Court of Appeals.
Quite a powerhouse firm.
Well, at one point, Cletus McWilliams was in the Franklin office, and Cletus was a big Democrat, and he was thinking about running for governor in 1978, the same time that Lamar was going to be running. So it would be that we would have 2 gubernatorial candidates from the same law firm if he had gotten the nomination.
And you joined D&E in 1973.
Correct.
After your clerkship. So while we're talking about the firm, let's go ahead and play through the D&E's history, and then we'll circle back around and talk a little bit about your practice particularly. So how did D&E progress over the next 20 years?
Well, in 1973, it was just a sort of a catch-as-catch-can. We were trying to do whatever we could for developing clients. Bill Dearborn had been working for Commerce Union Bank doing second mortgages. So we were doing that. We were doing title work for the bank, and we had some construction folks that we worked with. Joe Rogers was one of the people that we were doing a lot of work for. And the firm, as I said, started out when I was there with 13. And from then, we got up to about 85 people by the end of, about the first of 1980. And then the Tax Relief Act came in, and it just decimated our real estate practice because we were doing a tremendous amount of condominium conversion work. And so all of those folks that we had, say 15, 20 people, really had nothing to do after that. And so the firm sort of went downhill from there. I guess it was sort of an implosion in 1992 when the banking folks and the litigation folks and the healthcare folks joined Boult, Cummings, Connors, and Berry. And so I started, as I said, it with Dearborn and Ewing in 1973, and then in 1992, I and several others went to Boult, and I stayed there until I retired, essentially. Well, essentially until I retired.
So who were the people that went from Dearborn and Ewing to Boult that you recall?
healthcare would be John Gilmore. I remember John was there, John Hastings. He was more of a regulatory lawyer. And Bob Warner, me, Jeff Powell. Interesting story. Jeff was a former football player at the University of Tennessee who had a major game in the Sugar Bowl against Miami, but he was also a practicing attorney. And there were several of us that went over there. Bill Earthman doing a lot of the banking work. So we mixed in well because our practices just overlapped. And I'd had some referrals in the past from Boult of some of their construction people that I had done some work for.
So it turned out to be a good move for your group.
Turned out to be a good move for those of us who went to the firm, and then others made good moves too. Now they went to different law firms, and as a result, there have been there are a lot of successful lawyers.
Well, and you had indicated earlier a lot of them ended up going on the bench at one point or another, including Judge Eccles.
Eccles became a federal judge at that time, and as I said, Lou was a Court of Appeals judge, and Matt Sweeney was circuit court judge. That's it.
So let's back up a little bit. Did you focus your practice on any areas of law, or did you find yourself becoming specialized by what you were drawn into? Talk a little bit about that.
I was very lucky. I started here, as I said, in doing litigation work, just general catch-as-you-catch-can type of work. In mid-'70s, I got a call from one of the people that I had interviewed in Knoxville to take my place and who had worked for Judge Wilson. He had gone to Boise, Idaho. He was an outdoors person. He loved to kayak, and he was kayaking down the Snake River, but he was also representing a company called Morrison Knudsen. And they had a contract in Tullahoma at the Arnold Air Base there to build a wind tunnel. And it was, at that time, it was the largest peacetime contract ever administered by the Corps of Engineers. And so he called and said that they had a little labor problem there. They had some strikes, and they had no strike, no lockout clause in their contracts, and wanted to know if I knew anything about labor law. And I said, of course I do. So I
whether you did or not.
I did or not. That's right. I was going to learn. So anyway, they hired me to handle this particular issue, and within the next 2 years, I was spending 2 to 3 days a week in Tullahoma at that project because of all the legal issues they had. Later, they brought in an in-house counsel, another attorney, not the one that referred the case to me, and then my work picked up. And so from the mid to late 70s and early 80s, I did mostly construction work dealing with this government contract. That led into work being done on the Tennessee Tom Bibby Waterway project. That was mostly a labor issue, labor-intensive representation where they're really just moving dirt, nothing to do with the true construction contracts. We had several litigated matters coming out of the wind tunnel, because if you remember, at that time we had sort of runaway inflation, a little bit more than what we've got today.
I was 8, so I don't
you don't
specifically remember that,
right.
but
well,
I'll take your word for it.
Interest rates had been historically low at around 6%. They jumped by 1982 when Jimmy Carter was in the office to 22%. And that ties into another part of my career. But so a lot of these subcontractors weren't able to perform or wanted to have additional monies added to their contracts. And so it was dealing primarily with the contractual aspects of the construction project. The greatest story about that, though, is that the project manager was a guy named Doc Poteet. And Doc had been with, I guess it was the big contractor over in Vietnam. And when the Tet Offensive occurred, he pulled all of his people out into the harbor. And they just said they watched the fireworks going off. but he was just a salty dog. I mean, every other word in his mouth was out of his mouth was an expletive. And he had a great negotiating tactic. This was a contract administered by the Corps of Engineers, and so all these Corps people would come out dressed in their uniforms. Their shirts were pressed. Had their ties on, stuck in, and Doc would always be on the site watching what was going on. If they came up and criticized anything, he would get right up in their face, and he always had a wad of tobacco in his mouth. And as he was talking to them, the spit just came out all over the uniforms. And they would walk away, you could just sort of see them moving away from this wild thing that was out there spitting tobacco at them. So I learned how to negotiate through Doc Poteet.
A little rougher than most, I take it.
Yeah.
So, and just so it's clear, so the individual that introduced you to this client at Arnold Air Force Base was the same person that you had helped the judge hire to be your replacement when you were
That's correct.
on the clerkship. So
That's correct.
Kind of first lesson in client development is to make sure that you get to know
right
good
person.
people.
Good people. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And make a good first impression on them. You talked a little bit about your first trial in front of Judge Morton. Did you win that jury trial?
We did. It was sort of an interesting case. As I said, the aiding and abetting a securities law violation. And what was happening, a stockbroker was taking a prospectus, and he was changing the first and the last pages. And he designated the Commerce Union Bank as being his bank. And so all the funds that were generated from the sale of these securities, these bogus securities, were deposited into the bank. And Allen High, who later became chancellor, was representing the plaintiffs in that case. And so that was my first experience with C. Allen High, soon to be chancellor. And but we ended up getting a defendant's verdict in that case.
And you say Lou Connor worked on that case with you?
Oh, he held my hand. He didn't work on the case. You know, if Judge Morton was addressing me, he'd poke me to stand up. You know, do this. You know.
So next time I see Lou, I'll tell him that you taught him everything he knew about.
That's right.
How to try a case.
You can tell him that.
So you said you worked on the Arnold and then the Bigby Waterway project.
Tom Bigby
Waterway project, yeah. And then so what was the next significant type of case that you got a chance to work on in your career?
All right, we started doing just general banking type of work, and then the construction project in Tullahoma, and then in February of 1983, we had the Butcher Bank failures, starting with United American Bank in Knoxville. And we were engaged to represent the D&O insurance carrier that had written a policy for the United American Bank and 2 other Jake Butcher related banks and 6 C.H. Butcher banks, C&C banks. Now, for those who don't remember, Jake Butcher was very instrumental in bringing the World's Fair to Knoxville. But what he had done is in the 60s, he had bought United American Bank, Knoxville. It was old Hamilton Bank. They changed the name to United American Bank. And in order to finance that, he borrowed a whole lot of money. He didn't have a lot of money in it. He had to borrow it. And the only way then that he could pay for the stock that he had purchased was by declaring dividends from the bank. So the dividends could only be declared once you had profits within the bank. Everything worked out real well until the interest rates started increasing. And on the other side of this equation, you had C.H. Butcher, his brother, who had a lot of what were known as the C&C banks and city and county banks. And United American Bank, being the biggest, handled all of the backroom transactions, the check cashings and the deposits, etc., postings for the banks. And they handled all the loan processing. So they were able to transfer these loans from one bank to another whenever they would start to go bad, get a new borrower in so that Jake could continue to put profits in the books and continue to pay the dividends. So anyway, the bank failed in February on Valentine's Day weekend, I guess it was, in 1983. And then we were engaged after that to represent the insurance carrier for all of these different banks. That caused us to both seek to rescind our policies, which we tried to do, and to work with the directors and officers in the defense of the lawsuits being brought by the FDIC. So that was a lawsuit that several lawsuits, but it took place over a whole decade. I mean, it started out in 1983 and it ended, I think, in 1992.
And how many banks? You said the butcher banks. How many banks did they have in total?
Under the National Union D&O policies, they had 3 and 6. We had 9 of the banks, and there were about 5 or 6 other banks that were insured by another carrier that we didn't represent.
So how did the case turn out? Were you able to get the policy rescinded?
It was really sort of. This is a good war story. We filed a rescission suit claiming that we wrote the policy based on false financial statements. As I said, what had happened during this period when the interest rates were so low that Jake was able to make interest payments by declaring dividends on the stock. But as the economy changed, when the interest rates started increasing in the late 70s, as it did, then he couldn't write off any bad loans because he had to have the profits of the bank. And so it just became I don't want to describe it like it's really not a Ponzi scheme, but it's where they would create fictitious borrowers in companies to assume an existing loan, capitalize the interest on it, so it appeared that they were making a profit, but in fact he was distributing the assets of the company rather than the profits of the company. And so it just got into a situation where it was unsustainable. But the financial statements always reflected this income. And you had these directors who some were on the inside and some that were outside directors. And the outside directors really didn't know what was going on per se, but some of the insiders, i.e. Jake and a guy named Jesse Barr, who was not a director, but he was another known criminal out of Memphis. But anyway, the banks failed. And we ended up filing a lawsuit on behalf of the insurance D&O carrier seeking to rescind the policy. The FDIC had filed suit against the directors and some of the named officers, claiming that their negligence allowed the bank to stay open and make all these bad loans, and therefore the FDIC lost all of the money on it. It was like I guess the assets were about $750 million at the time that it failed, and the good assets were maybe $200 million. So I mean, it was a house of cards. But anyway, sort of getting ahead of myself, the FDIC also sued the accounting firm, and this is typically what happens when the FDIC would take over a bank. And so they sued the accounting firm for
on behalf of the bank as a receiver.
Well, they brought in the corporate capacity. The FDIC operated both as the receiver of the failed bank, and then also in its corporate capacity as the insurer. So when it enters into a purchase and assumption agreement where a new bank comes in and assumes the assets and the liabilities of the bank, it's acting in its corporate capacity. But as receiver, whatever assets are there that it can collect, it is collecting them to pay the creditors of the bank, other than the depositors. But sort of bouncing around here, I guess you should say, the FDIC then, bringing this claim against the accounting firm, had to first prove that the financial statements were false. And then it was going to, second phase of that case, it was going to put on its expert testimony as to how the accounting firm was negligent in not analyzing the financial statements correctly. So what happened in that, our case got bumped back following the FDIC's suit against the accounting firm. So when our suit came up, we were able to use the testimony and the evidence produced by the FDIC as to the false financial statements, because that just dovetailed into our defense in our rescission claim, that we relied upon these same financial statements that the FDIC has already proven was false. So we were able to get summary judgment on the big D&O policy at United American Bank Knoxville. The FDIC had brought a claim for, I think, 25 or 28 million, and they gave notice in 2 policy years to try to up the insurance amounts. They entered into a non-recourse settlement with the directors and officers, and they got judgments of like $45 million. And they tried to push that claim back against the D&O insurer, and we were able to get rescission of the policies to sort of take that money right out of the government's mouth.
Used their evidence against them, did you?
We did. That was sort of a classic thing.
So you spent 10 years working on the Butcher Bank collapse and the representing the.
Well, I was doing other things.
Yeah,
in
sure.
too. But, yeah.
What type of activities did you engage in and of significance in the 1990s?
Well, one of the things that was going on at that time was the construction of the arena, and the general contractor in that was a company called Perini, and Perini was having financial problems, and when the subs weren't getting paid timely, they started complaining to MDHA, who was in charge of the construction. And so MDHA brought me on to represent the city's interest in the litigation that was going to follow the completion of the project. And so after the project was completed, all these claims were made, and I got involved in it. And one of the things we did was we had all these different lawyers representing the different subcontractors. There must have been 10 or 12 or 13 of them. And we set depositions in December. We set them for the first 2 weeks of December, 10 days straight. And we took a break for Christmas. And during that break, obviously, all the attorneys that were involved in each of these depositions, and we held them in our offices, and we had this huge conference room where everybody was sitting around, and it just went on and on and on. But by the time we get through Christmas, all the attorneys started billing their clients, and everybody who was so up in arms trying to go after Perini this, Perini that, got a dose of reality when the legal fees started coming in at the end of the month of December. And by the time we set the depositions back up in the mid-January, we had settled at least 10 of the 13 lawsuits at that point. And I think ultimately we settled all but one, primarily just simply forcing those folks to know it's going to be expensive. And that occurred. So we were able to do that. And then following that, we got into the negotiations with the Oilers coming to the city. And MDHA was going to be involved in that construction, and they asked me to prepare the contracts. So I was able to prepare the general conditions to the project, along with the contracts for the architect and for the construction company that was going to do the actual building. So that was another aspect of what I had moved into from the construction side of the practice.
Wow, you really participated on some major construction projects here in Nashville.
I was just lucky. I was at the right place at the right time.
So you actually drew up the construction contract for the Nissan Stadium.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow.
There was some of the interesting points. If you remember the arena, after it was completed, the architects touted the slope of the curvature of the roof line. The first lawsuit that was brought was by the steel fabricator on that fabricated roof. On the stadium, the focal point were those big red light fixtures outside. The first lawsuit that came out of the stadium involved those light fixtures because of the difference in the tolerances between concrete and steel. So the architects, it was interesting negotiating with them. It was a great company. It's I can't even think of the name of them now, but they wanted the property right, their intellectual property rights, so they could sell T-shirts with that light fixture on it. And that was the biggest dispute we had between the Titans and the architects. The Titan says, we're paying for your intellectual property rights. We own those T-shirt rights. So anyway, that's just all over the side.
So you got to do some major construction and be involved in some major construction projects during that time period. Did you continue with any of your fiduciary work that you had worked on with National Union?
Yes, as we did more and more of the Butcher Bank stuff, got involved in it, dealing with the various people in the company as they were rising through the ranks. I was growing older too, and they moved into other areas. And so following that, I was put on several of their panels, the Financial Institutions panel, and that sent a lot of business my way. Bank trust departments, security brokers, broker-dealers, and did a lot of FINRA regulatory arbitration work. So that worked out real well as well.
And you continue to do some MDHA work as well, right? Yes,
they seemed to have a lot of questions that came up periodically, and they were doing a lot of renovation work on the housing projects. And so that was just sort of pick up the phone and call Rick, what's going on.
Yeah, you and I got to try a project. I forgot what the project, it might have been Preston Miller Homes that we did
Preston Taylor?
Preston Taylor Homes that we did an MDHA case on.
Yeah. Well, of course, you and I had the best case in the world, Bardstown Fire.
Your favorite jury trial of all time? Tell the audience a little bit about that trial, starting from the incident that led up to it, to me spending the night in a jail cell.
Well, there's a distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky.
Heaven Hill.
And Heaven Hill had these warehouses that were block, I don't call them silos, but they were block warehouses. But they had thatched roofs, wooden roofs. And a fire occurred, and obviously sparks went from one place to another, and all these warehouses burned down, and the whiskey that was being stored in there started rolling down this hill into a creek, and there's a song, Heaven Hill is burning down, or something like that.
River's on fire.
River's on fire. But it turned out to be a pretty devastating event for the Heaven Hill distillery. And we represented a wholesale insurance broker by the name of McAleer. They were out of somewhere in Michigan, Lansing, Michigan, I guess, or somewhere up in there. And the insurance company, I think, was Hartford. And there was a local broker who had gotten the McAleer involved in trying to place the policy. And in trying to place the policy, they were trying to get blanket coverage, because Heaven Hill had warehouses in 4 or 5 different states. And so one of the key pieces of evidence that came out was a Post-it note.
Pink phone
note. Not a Post-it note, a pink phone note, where the broker at McAleer had received a message from the underwriter at Hartford, said can't do blanket, can do blanket per location. And I never had heard of blanket per location, but apparently what it meant was that if you have a $20 million policy at location 1, that $20 million policy is for anything that occurs on that one. They in turn took the position that no, that it was a policy that was related to each individual warehouse, because they had been given the numbers for each of those warehouses as to the amount of inventory that would be stored in there. So it was a difference of whether they were going to get $6 million or whether they were going to get $20 million as a result of the insurance coverage. And so Heaven Hill filed suit against the local broker, claiming that they should have gotten this type of coverage, and against McAleer, who was the wholesale broker, and against the Hartford. So we had this jury trial up in Bardstown, Kentucky. And when we went up there, we rented the B&B at that time, but it was the old jail up there. And Russ, of course, being the youngest lawyer involved in it, had to spend the night downstairs in a jail cell. They still had the jail cell. They still had the doors and the bars. But
very appropriate.
Very appropriate. And we ended up trying that case over about a week period of time. And after it was over, the jury came back and held that it was blanket per location, primarily based upon that one little piece of evidence that occurred, and that they were liable for the $20 million policy limits. And the court allowed the attorneys to talk to the jury. And now Hartford had sent down this lawyer from Chicago who didn't expect, I don't know what he did, well, he didn't expect our people to testify. And I don't know why, but he was just an arrogant so-and-so, and he came down and really irritated a lot of people in that trial. So after the trial was over, we were talking to the jurors, and Russ and I were standing over on one side, and we were talking to two or three of them. You know, what did y'all think of so-and-so? What did you think about this? How did we mess up? How did we do what was right? And we hear this little commotion next to us. And there was this one juror who I guess was talking to the lawyer from Chicago. And we hear this, if you don't get out of my face, I'm gonna kick your, and we were just shocked. But that lawyer from Chicago had apparently alienated the jury so bad that this one juror was going to get into a fight with him.
Turned out to be a big win for our client and Heaven Hill.
Well, we enjoyed that one. That was a good trial.
So what other types of significant activities did you get a chance to work on for banks in your career?
Well, I guess it was in 2008 when we had the
well, now, back up and say how you had that relationship.
Oh, well. All right, I'm sorry.
That was important for people to see that, because our firm still represents Bank of America till today.
All right. When I first came to Nashville, our firm was doing work for Commerce Union Bank. Commerce Union Bank was one of the original banks in Tennessee that was grandfathered in. It had branches all over the state when you really couldn't have a branch. But it merged with a bank in Virginia, and it then became Sovereign Bank. I continued to represent Sovereign. Sovereign then merged with CNS Bank out of Atlanta, and that was CNS Sovereign at that point. CNS Sovereign then became Nations Bank. That was when North Carolina National Bank ended up acquiring that joint entity. And Nations Bank ultimately became Bank of America. And I'll tell you a little funny aside on this. Back when the Butcher Bank failures occurred, there were also failures in Texas. And these huge banks, First Republic of Dallas, I think it was, and another bank down there, failed. And the FDIC worked out a deal with North Carolina National Bank. Hugh McCall, who was the president of North Carolina National Bank, went in, bought the assets of the bank at market, not book, at market. Now,
that's Butcher Banks and the First Republic?
No, just the Texas banks. I'm going to tie it all back in. But when you stop and think what had happened with interest rates historically had been in the 4, 5, 6 range. But then in the Jimmy Carter era, it jumped up to 22%. Back then, banks were required to have their reserves physically in bonds. So a bond issued at an interest rate period of 3%, interest rates go to 22%, that bond is virtually zero. It has almost lost all of its value. So what happened, NCNB had a deal with the FDIC that on any loan, that they would transfer the loan, if it was 90 days past due, to another company that NCNB set up, and the FDIC would pay them 60 cents on the dollar. So if you then think about the loans going in default, NCNB became known as no cash for nobody because they weren't making any new loans. They were allowing these loans to be transferred to another one of its arms, getting paid 60 cents on the dollar, and if they could collect anything more than that, it was profit to them. The big profit, though, came when the interest rates dropped from 22% back down to 10% or 12%, whatever it was. So NCNB became flush with cash. So it then starts an acquisition. It opens a non-bank bank in Florida. It converts it to a bank. So they're in the Florida market. It then buys a bank up in Boston, Fleet. And then when the CNS Sovereign Bank was having financial troubles as part of its merged entity, it acquires it. So Bank of America, well, later, then that was still Nations Bank. But later, the same thing happened. On the West Coast, you had Bank of America. It bought the assets of Continental, but it started having bad problems on the Pacific Rim. So then you had Hugh McCall in Charlotte taking over the name of Bank of America and moving all of those operations from San Francisco over to Charlotte. So then we started representing Bank of America at that point, which is just that normal progression on up from Commerce Union Bank up to the current part. But in the mortgage meltdown, Bank of America had a lot of loans outstanding to Countrywide, and it took over Countrywide. But in doing that, with the mortgage meltdown, we had a lot of foreclosure issues coming up. In that era, we also had these revelations, I guess is the way to describe it, that these foreclosure firms were offshoring most of their work to India or some other place, and they were filing these affidavits not based on, quote, personal knowledge as stated in it. So we hit sort of a situation where the DOJ came in, started hammering the banks. Beginning in, I guess, about 2009, I was engaged to monitor foreclosure law firms' activities to make sure that their activities were consistent with, quote, good banking practices. And so for about 4 years there, I flew around the country monitoring these law firms in various locations, and it was sort of interesting. You would go in, you would review files, and if you found anything that was out of kilter or not proper, the government would come in and shut the law firms down, and that occurred because Fannie Mae would move their authority, and once you got that done, the firms just dissolved. And there was a firm in Florida that had like 600 employees, most of whom were just paralegals, doing nothing. It was just a foreclosure mill, just a mill. And I think Fannie Mae took out their loans on a Friday, and we went in on behalf of a couple of other clients on Monday, and they had a meeting at the office, fired 400 and some odd people on that Monday. And you're talking about people walking in, and we weren't looked at upon with favor at that point. But needless to say, that was sort of the I guess the end of what I did for the banking world, because I stayed on for about 3 or 4 years doing that, and then again representing the bank in in litigation, mortgage litigation, following my I guess my transition into the foreclosure firms.
So you retired in 2000. Well, before I ask this question, any other cases or fun things that you remember about your career that you think the audience would like to hear about?
Well, no, not really. I think my career would be just sort of being in the right place at the right time. I was lucky. I would admit that I was lucky, but I also thought I was a pretty good lawyer.
You were a heck of a lawyer. You still are.
Well, thank you, sir. But
and that's why you got retained on so many important matters.
Well, it seemed to mushroom, and one thing led to another. And as I said, you can go from just catch as catch can to getting a big client, working on the construction stuff, and continuing that aspect of the work, and then getting into the bank failures, and then continuing the spin-offs from that type of work, and then continuing back with just general commercial litigation, arbitration in the construction industry. And so it was a good period for me. 45 years.
What advice would you give young lawyers today about their practice? What to do?
Russ, I was not a good mentor, but get a good mentor. Find somebody that you can look up to that can help you learn the ropes, so to speak. I had that rope given to me when I clerked for the federal court. That was a great experience that I had, and I was able to bootstrap that into what I hoped I would say is a good litigation career. The other aspects of it were, I guess is the way to describe it, being available, keeping contacts, and being able to perform the work that you're given. Don't exceed what you're capable of doing. Be prepared. I was always overly prepared in most everything that I did, and it's strenuous, but hey, it's a great occupation.
Well, I will say on behalf of me and many others that you are an excellent mentor.
Well,
everybody has different mentoring styles, but you are certainly an outstanding person to learn to practice law from. Well, what are you doing in retirement?
Well, today, let's see, I retired December 31, 2016. And the last official act I did was go to the firm's box and watch the Music City Bowl. And until today, I have not been back to the law office. I had an opportunity, if I'd wanted to have an office and continue to come in. But I decided that I didn't want to do that. The logic behind it was something that my father-in-law said at one point. He was a doctor in Knoxville, very prominent physician. He had a huge practice. And he retired, and I asked him, I said, well, why did you retire? Because I thought you were in the height of your practice. And he said that over the years, he had seen too many professionals stay on after they should have retired. And he had seen so many doctors being referred to as Dr. Joe Smith. He used to be a good doctor. And Ann's father told me, he said, I did not want to be known as used to be a good doctor. So I sort of felt that way myself. I felt that after 45 years that I could know that and realize that I was not as sharp as I once was. I used to be able to cite you cases, you know this. I used to be able to cite the code sections, and I noticed after the last 2 or 3 years that I was not quite as capable of doing that as I had in the past. And so I said, look, that's enough. And so I was 70, and I had 45 years of experience, and I said that's practicing enough. Now it's time to go out and do something real.
And what are you doing?
I played a lot of golf.
Traveling?
And we're traveling a lot. We've taken a lot of riverboat cruises over in Europe. It's a great excursion. I encourage people to do that if you want to. One of our sons lives in San Diego, and so we've been going out usually for a month in February and a month at the end of the summer, spending time out there with him and our little girl, granddaughter, and started reading a lot. As I said, I was trained, I wasn't educated. And so now I'm spending a lot of time going back and reading all these good books that I never had an opportunity to do as I was too busy practicing law.
So, last question. How did the practice of law change over the 45 years that you were practicing? What were the biggest things that affected the practice?
Here's an illustration. Back in, I guess, 73 or 74, one of the big fights that we had in our law firm was trying to decide why Lou Connor's secretary needed a Selectric typewriter when everybody else had just the regular old typewriters. That was a big issue back at that time. And then, of course, obviously, the research tools have changed everything. Back when I first came to town, I was engaged by J.G. Lackey, who was then the head of the Nashville School of Law, because they were having trouble with their graduates passing the bar. And so he brought me in, he hired me to tutor recent graduates on how to write and how to analyze issues that they were going to face on the bar exam. And then from there, he hired Jim Creasy and me to teach a legal research and writing course. Now, you have to realize that when you're trying to do a research project with 90 folks, it's kind of hard when you don't have a computer, when everybody's going to the same books to try to get the same information out. So that's been one of the major changes, has been the computerization, the computers and the research. You see it's so much easier to do now than when we started. A lot of people feel that the camaraderie within the bar has lost. There's so many lawyers out now, you don't really know that many people that well. When I first started, maybe had my bar number was 1973 or something like that.
1973?
Yeah, something like that. And now it's up to 20,000. So you can't meet people. You don't know the people that well, even those within your own firm. You don't know them if you're not on the same floor with them, if you're not in the same area with them doing the same type of work. It's kind of hard to know. So you lose a little bit of that camaraderie. We used to have the bar association picnics and golf tournaments, and you'd go out there and you know everybody. But now, you don't. The practice, I really think we've got a lot of good lawyers, real good lawyers. Probably too many. We're competing for the same people, a lot of the same clients. But I know that it's a profitable organization. So it's kind of difficult to say, how has it changed? Yeah, it's probably changed for the better, at least from a profit standpoint.
Yep. Well, thank you on behalf of the Historical Committee for taking time to speak with us today. I know that having the opportunity to practice law with you, and I will say on a personal note that I started in 1999, and you were a younger man, and when you told me you were retiring at 70, I couldn't believe you were 70. I still thought you were 55. So you never aged in my mind. Thank you for your time today, Rick.
Thank you.